The year was 1939. Europe was once again at war. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched uneasily as Nazi Germany swept through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying speed. The age of the modern fighter had begun, and America knew it needed something powerful, fast, and deadly to meet the storm that was coming. At the Republic Aviation Corporation in Farmingdale, New York, a brilliant Georgian-born engineer named Alexander Kartveli was already sketching the future. Kartveli had fled Soviet Russia after the revolution and built his life around a simple belief. If you want a pilot to live, build a plane that can take a beating and still bring him home. Kartveli's earlier design, the P-35, had been sleek but underpowered. Couldn't match the speed or climb rate of German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109. So, in 1940, when the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a new requirement for a high-altitude interceptor, Kartveli began to dream bigger, much bigger. What he imagined seemed absurd to many engineers of the time. A fighter powered by the enormous Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower engine usually reserved for bombers. It was massive, heavy, and demanded a completely new airframe. To make it breathe at high altitudes, Kartveli added a turbo supercharger system, routed through long ducts running behind the pilot. This made the fuselage round and bulky, not sleek like a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt. But that bulk hid a secret. It was armor and muscle. The prototype, designated XP-47B, rolled out in 1941. At first glance, it looked too big, too fat, and too heavy to fight. Test pilots joked that it looked like a milk bottle with wings. Mechanics called it a 7-ton monster. But when it roared down the runway for its first flight on May 6, 1941, the laughter stopped. The XP-47B climbed faster than expected and reached speeds over 400 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest fighters in the world. And when test pilot Lowry Brabham fired the 8.50 caliber machine guns for the first time, the sound echoed like thunder. The airframe shook, but it held together, a flying tank that could dish out punishment and take it too. Still, there were problems. The engine overheated, the turbo supercharger ducts vibrated, and the cockpit got so hot pilots called it the sauna. Yet Kartveli refused to give up. "A fighter must be strong," he told his team. "If it is strong, the pilot will live. If the pilot lives, he will fight again." By the time the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the P-47 program was in full motion. Republic's factory worked day and night, filling hangars with the roar of rivet guns and the smell of hot metal. The design evolved: new cooling vents, stronger wings, and a bigger canopy. Every flaw was hammered out with sweat and sleepless nights. When the first production models, P-47B and P-47C, reached the U.S. Army Air Forces in early 1942, the reaction was mixed. Pilots admired its speed and ruggedness, but complained about its size and poor visibility on takeoff. Some called it a jug, short for juggernaut, while others said it looked like a milk jug, a nickname that would stick. But soon, that jug would prove itself in ways no one expected. The plane's sheer mass became its advantage. It could dive faster than any fighter in existence, past 500 miles per hour without tearing its wings off. The big radial engine, protected by armor and thick steel plates, could take hits that would destroy a liquid-cooled engine. Pilots would later say the P-47 could be shot to pieces and still fly home. In 1943, the first P-47 Thunderbolts crossed the Atlantic to join the 56th Fighter Group in England. The war in the air over Europe was brutal. American bombers, B-17s and B-24s, were being torn apart by Luftwaffe fighters. The Thunderbolts' mission was to protect them. At first, the German pilots laughed. The P-47 was huge, slow to climb, and easy to spot. They called it the flying milk bottle. But laughter would soon turn to fear. Back in the United States, the engineers at Republic kept improving the machine. The P-47D variant arrived with a bubble canopy for better visibility, external fuel tanks for longer range, and stronger wing pylons for bombs and rockets. The Thunderbolt was becoming not just a fighter, but a symbol of American industrial might. The secret to its power lay deep in its design philosophy. Most fighters of the era were delicate, built for agility, not endurance. Kartvel's creation was the opposite: overbuilt, overpowered, and unapologetically heavy. It was, as one historian put it, a sledgehammer in a knife fight. The pilots who first trained on the P-47 had to unlearn everything they knew. You didn't turn tightly in a Thunderbolt. You used speed, altitude, and dive. You struck fast, and if you were in trouble, you dove away. Nothing could catch you in a dive, not even a Messerschmitt. By mid-1943, the skies over Europe began to change. The same plane that had once been mocked was now shredding German fighters in head-on attacks, thanks to its 8 roaring .50 caliber guns. The Luftwaffe's taunts faded, replaced by radio calls filled with alarm. Achtung! Thunderbolts! But none of that glory was visible yet in 1941, when the first Thunderbolt sat on the tarmac, gleaming in the sun, its propeller blades still and silent. To the men who built it, it was more than metal. It was a promise, a machine born not from perfection, but from persistence, sweat, and the belief that strength could be beautiful. As the engine started and the propeller spun, the air vibrated with power. Mechanics shielded their ears. The roar was deafening, the birth cry of a legend. Soon, that legend would cross the Atlantic, take to the skies over a burning Europe, and show the world that the flying milk bottle was no joke. It was the sound of thunder, and thunder, once awakened, could not be mocked. By the spring of 1943, the skies over Europe had become a deadly chessboard. German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs ruled the air above France and the Low Countries, tearing into American bomber formations with precision and confidence. Then, from the west, a new aircraft appeared, enormous, silver, and round like a barrel. The Luftwaffe pilots had never seen anything like it. At first glance, it looked wrong. The P-47 Thunderbolt was huge, nearly twice the size of the slender Bf-109. Its wide fuselage gleamed white in the sunlight, and its stubby wings looked too short to lift such bulk. German pilots peering through their canopies laughed. They nicknamed it Die Fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. To them, it was a slow, overweight machine, a lumbering target that had no place in a dogfight. But they didn't yet know what it could do. In the first few months of 1943, American bomber losses were catastrophic. The 8th Air Force was sending hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses into the heart of occupied Europe, and dozens were not coming back. Luftwaffe fighters attacked from the sun, from below, from head-on, tearing open bomber formations with 20mm cannons. The U.S. desperately needed a fighter that could escort the bombers deeper into enemy territory, high above the clouds. The Thunderbolt was chosen for the job. The 56th Fighter Group, known as Zemke's Wolfpack, after their tough commander, Hubert "Hub" Zemke, became the first to take the big, strange-looking P-47 into battle. When Zemke's men arrived in England and saw their new aircraft, even they were skeptical. One pilot muttered, "We're supposed to fight the Luftwaffe in that?" Another joked, "It looks like a milk jug with wings." The nickname stuck, the Jug. But Zemke understood something the Germans didn't. The Thunderbolt size wasn't a weakness. It was armor. The P-47's massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine gave it raw power unmatched by any single-engine fighter of its time. Once airborne, it could climb to the bomber formations quickly, and once it gained altitude, it became a monster in a dive. The milk bottle might look heavy, but it fell like lightning. In its first missions, the Thunderbolt faced harsh criticism. Radio failures, engine problems, and short-range limited early successes. German pilots, confident and experienced, still mocked the Americans. They called the new arrivals easy kills. Then came April 1943. During a bomber escort mission over France, Zemke's Wolfpack encountered a group of FW-190s. The Germans dove in, expecting an easy victory. Instead, the P-47s rolled over and dove back, straight down. The Thunderbolt's heavy frame gave it incredible dive speed, over 500 miles per hour, far beyond what the German fighters could safely match. Zemke's pilots pulled out of their dives below the bombers, looped back up, and caught the Germans by surprise. 8.50 caliber machine guns roared in unison, spewing 13 rounds a second each. The sky lit up with tracers, and within seconds, an FW-190 burst into flames. Another disintegrated midair. When the surviving Luftwaffe pilots returned to base, the laughter was gone. But the nickname Flying Milk Bottle didn't disappear. It evolved. What had started as a joke became a mark of reluctant respect. German intelligence briefings began warning fighter squadrons of a new, heavy American fighter capable of extreme dives and high-altitude attacks. In the mess halls and briefing rooms of Luftwaffe airfields, the pilots whispered about it. "The milk bottle can dive like the devil," one said. "And its guns, Acht Maschinengewehr, 8 machine guns. They cut through anything." For the Americans, the transformation was just beginning. The Thunderbolt's pilots were learning how to use their aircraft properly. They discovered its strengths, power dives, high-speed slashing attacks, and rugged durability. Unlike the fragile Spitfires or nimble Mustangs that demanded finesse, the Jug was about brute force. You didn't dance in a P-47, you struck hard and fast. One American ace later said, "It was like wrestling a bear, but if you learned how to handle it, nothing could touch you." Meanwhile, on the ground, the mechanics of the 56 Fighter Group were working miracles. They fixed turbo-supercharger problems, tuned engines, and modified fuel systems to extend range. The Thunderbolt evolved almost weekly. By mid-1943, new versions, the P-47C and D models, began arriving. They carried more ammunition, better radios, and external drop tanks for longer flights. Now, the milk bottle could reach deep into Germany. The first major test came in the summer of 1943, during raids on German industrial targets. The Thunderbolts escorted bombers as far as the Ruhr Valley, Happy Valley. The Americans called it, though it was anything but happy. That day, the Luftwaffe came in waves. Dozens of Bf-109s and FW-190s slashed into the bomber streams. But waiting for them high above were the Thunderbolts. The sky erupted in chaos. The Jug pilots dove, firing 8 streams of .50 caliber Fury. German aircraft exploded in midair, some breaking apart before they could even turn away. Witnesses said it looked like a thunderstorm made of bullets. One German pilot's final words over the radio were chilling. "Achtung! Die Milchflaschen schießen." Attention! The milk bottles are shooting. After that day, no one laughed at the name again. The Thunderbolt's reputation grew quickly. Pilots who once mocked its bulk now praised its survivability. Stories spread of Jugs returning home riddled with holes, engines smoking, half the tail missing, yet still landing safely. It was not the prettiest aircraft in the sky, but it was a fighter built for war, not for beauty. The flying milk bottle had become the flying fortress's shield. By late 1943, Luftwaffe pilots began to change tactics. They avoided head-on attacks when Thunderbolts were present, preferring to dive away or attack from below. The once overconfident German aces were now wary, cautious, and exhausted. In reports intercepted by Allied intelligence, One phrase appeared repeatedly.
Der Thunderbolt ist gefährlich.
The Thunderbolt is dangerous. Back at Republic Aviation, Alexander Kartveli and his engineers followed the combat reports with pride. The very shape that had made their aircraft a joke. The thick fuselage, the oversized nose, the bulky cowling had saved lives. The milk bottle had proven its worth. Kartveli famously said, "Let them laugh at its shape. The pilot will not laugh when he comes home alive." And indeed, pilots did come home alive, again and again. By the end of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had rewritten the rules of air combat. What began as an object of ridicule had become one of the most feared machines in the European skies. The Luftwaffe had learned a painful lesson. Never judge a fighter by its looks. The flying milk bottle was no joke. It was thunder wrapped in steel, a brute that roared across the heavens, protecting those who could not protect themselves. And for every German pilot who once laughed at its shape, there came a moment, brief, terrifying, final, when they saw that round nose fill their gun sight, and the last thing they heard was the growl of 8.50 caliber guns unleashing the wrath of thunder. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared over Europe, German pilots mocked its shape. But they soon learned there was one thing about this big American fighter that no one could laugh at: its guns. 8 of them, 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, spitting out more than 13 rounds per second per gun. In less than 10 seconds, the Thunderbolt could fire nearly 100 pounds of lead. That wasn't just firepower, it was destruction on an industrial scale. Each bullet weighed nearly 2 ounces and traveled at almost 900 meters per second. When those rounds hit, they didn't just pierce. They shredded, burned, and tore apart metal, engines, and human flesh alike. For the first time, the skies over Europe thundered with a weapon that could end a dogfight before it even began. The concept of 8 guns wasn't born from excess. It was born from necessity. During the early years of the war, American and British pilots faced a brutal reality. The German Luftwaffe's aircraft were armored and tough. The .30 caliber rounds used by early Allied fighters simply bounced off their fuselages. It became clear that survival depended on hitting harder, faster, and longer. So when Republic Aviation designed the P-47, Alexander Kartveli didn't settle for 4 guns or 6. He wanted 8. To fit them, the Thunderbolt's thick wings were redesigned, reinforced, and fed by enormous ammunition belts that carried 425 rounds per gun. The total, over 3,400 rounds, meant a pilot could sustain bursts that seemed endless compared to any other fighter. But this came at a price: weight. The guns and ammo added hundreds of pounds, making the aircraft even heavier. Many critics argued it would slow the plane, reduce maneuverability, and make it an easy target. Kartveli disagreed. "If it gets hit," he said, "it must hit back harder." And the Thunderbolt did just that. Early in 1943, P-47s began flying escort missions over France. The Luftwaffe was still confident. Their sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s could outturn the Thunderbolt easily. But air combat is rarely about turning. It's about who fires first and who hits hardest. One of the first American aces to learn this was Captain Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group. On June 26, 1943, Johnson was escorting bombers over France when a German FW-190 attacked from behind, riddling his P-47 with cannon shells. The canopy jammed. The controls were shredded. Fuel poured from holes in the wings. But the jug refused to die. Johnson's Thunderbolt somehow stayed in the air. The German pilot, astonished, pulled alongside, expecting him to bail out. Johnson didn't. He yanked the trigger, unleashing all 8.50s. The FW-190 exploded in midair. Johnson limped home with over 200 bullet holes in his aircraft, and a legend was born. Soon, American pilots began to understand what those 8 Brownings really meant. In training, instructors would tell rookies, "Don't waste your ammo. 1 second of fire is enough to kill." And they were right. A 1-second burst from the Thunderbolt's guns could send 104 rounds tearing through a target, each capable of piercing a half-inch of armor or shredding a fighter's control surfaces. In combat, those seconds felt eternal. The steady vibration, the smell of gunpowder, the flash of tracers lighting the sky like fiery rain. In after-action reports, German survivors described what it felt like to be under that storm. "It was like being hit by a wall of fire," one Luftwaffe pilot said. "The sound of the guns was deafening, even inside my cockpit." And then the world went white. For the Americans, that thunder became their signature. The German nickname "Flying Milk Bottle" was fading fast. A new reputation was spreading: the thunderbolt that spits fire. By late 1943, the P-47s had become the backbone of American fighter operations in Europe. Their primary duty remained bomber escort, but pilots were eager to hunt. Many began to perfect new tactics that made use of the Thunderbolt's power and fire. The boom and zoom method became the hallmark of P-47 combat. The pilot climbed high above his target, then dove steeply at incredible speed, sometimes exceeding 500 miles per hour, lining up his enemy in the gun sight. At the right moment, he squeezed the trigger for 1, maybe 2 seconds, then pulled up and away before the enemy could react. The results were devastating. German fighters simply disintegrated under the concentrated fire. A hit from 4 or 5.50 caliber rounds could destroy an engine. A full burst could slice a wing clean off. American ace Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, one of the top P-47 pilots of the war, said it best: "If I got within range and fired those 8 guns, I didn't need a second pass. 1 burst, and it was over." But the Thunderbolt's guns weren't just deadly in the air. In late 1943 and early 1944, the P-47 began taking on a new role: ground attack. The same weapons that tore through aircraft could obliterate trains, trucks, and tanks. Thunderbolt pilots would strafe enemy convoys at low altitude, firing all 8 guns in sweeping passes. Each burst could destroy entire columns of vehicles. German soldiers came to fear the distinctive roar of its engine and the hailstorm that followed. Eyewitnesses described the aftermath of these attacks: armored cars turned inside out, trains derailed, and roads littered with burning wreckage. One Wehrmacht officer wrote, "When the big American fighters came, the ground shook as if from artillery. To the Allies below, the Thunderbolt was a guardian angel. To the Germans, it was death from the sky." The 8 guns turned the P-47 into something more than a fighter. They made it a symbol of overwhelming force. In the skies of Normandy, Italy, and later Germany itself, the sound of 8 Brownings firing in unison became the sound of Allied dominance. And as the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe's fear grew. Intercepted German radio messages told the story: "Achtung!
8 Maschinengewehre.
Don't let them behind you. Thunderbolts, they shoot like cannons." Even when newer, sleeker fighters like the P-51 Mustang arrived, many veteran pilots refused to give up their jugs. They trusted the strength, the armor, and the guns. As one of them, Lieutenant Colonel Walker Mahurin, once said, "You didn't need finesse with the P-47. You just pointed, fired, and watched the enemy disappear." By the war's end, the P-47 had fired more .50 caliber rounds than any other aircraft in history. Its 8 guns accounted for tens of thousands of destroyed enemy aircraft, vehicles, and trains. The Flying Milk Bottle had earned its new identity: the Thunderbolt, bringer of death and savior of men. Those 8 barrels told the world that size was not weakness. It was strength concentrated, relentless, and unstoppable. When German pilots saw the flash of tracers cutting through the sky, they no longer laughed. They dove for cover. They ran. Because they knew what was coming. 8.50 caliber reasons to fear. By the spring of 1943, the war in the skies over Europe had reached a breaking point. The U.S. 8th Air Force was losing bombers at an unsustainable rate. Thousands of young airmen flew deep into Nazi-occupied territory, often never to return. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were powerful machines, but without proper fighter cover, they were sitting ducks for the Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and Fw-190s. Germany's air defense network, radar stations, intercept controllers, flak batteries was brutally efficient. As bomber formations approached, Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled in swarms, attacking from above and head-on, ripping open the slow-moving giants with cannon fire. Every mission became a gamble with death. And so, in 1943, America sent its newest weapon into the storm, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England in early April. Painted in bare metal and olive drab, their big radial engines gleamed under the cold British sun. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, gathered around their new aircraft with mixed feelings: excitement, disbelief, and fear. Their commander, Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, a disciplined and fearless tactician, studied the plane in silence. He knew its reputation: heavy, sluggish on takeoff, and thirsty for fuel, but also its promise: speed, firepower, and raw durability. This plane, he told his men, will either save us or bury us. Their first combat mission came on April 8, 1943, a bomber escort over northern France. The formation climbed through clouds into hostile skies. German radar spotted them almost instantly. Within minutes, the radio crackled, "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." Fw-190s dove out of the sun, their yellow noses flashing. The young American pilots, barely trained for real combat, gripped their triggers as the enemy tore through the formation. The Thunderbolt's heavy frame shuddered as its 8 Brownings opened fire, and the war for the skies of Europe began in earnest. The fight was chaos. Black smoke, flashing tracers, and burning aircraft spiraled toward the ground. The P-47s were fast in a dive, but struggled to keep up in a climb. Several pilots were lost that day. The Germans returned to their bases laughing. "The milk bottles are too slow," they jeered, but they didn't know what was coming next. In the weeks that followed, Zemke's men learned and adapted. They discovered that the Thunderbolt was not meant to turn with the enemy. It was meant to strike hard and fast. Pilots began perfecting the boom and zoom attack. Dive from high altitude, fire a short burst, and use the jug's incredible speed to climb back to safety. It was a brutal tactic, and it worked. By June 1943, the Thunderbolts were claiming kills. The laughter on the German side began to fade. Every day, the bombers pushed deeper into enemy territory. Every day, the Thunderbolts flew higher, faster, and further. The long-range drop tanks, introduced in mid-1943, changed everything. They extended the P-47's reach from the French coast to the heart of Germany. Now the bombers weren't alone. Over the industrial Ruhr Valley, the flying milk bottles appeared beside them, roaring with fury. Luftwaffe pilots were stunned. The massive American fighter they had once mocked was now shredding their formations before they could reach the bombers. The 8.50 caliber guns that had once seemed excessive now unleashed storms of metal that tore Fw-190s apart. One German ace, recalling that summer, said, "We thought the Americans built toys, not fighters. Then the toys started killing us." Among the Thunderbolt pilots rising to fame was Captain Walker Bud Mahurin. On August 17, 1943, during the legendary Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, Mahurin and his squadron faced overwhelming odds. Hundreds of bombers streamed toward German factories while waves of Luftwaffe fighters attacked relentlessly. The sky was a battlefield of contrails, smoke, and fire. Mahurin spotted a formation of Bf-109s preparing to strike the bombers. He dove from 25,000 feet, guns blazing. One German plane exploded instantly. Another spun out of control, trailing flames. Mahurin didn't stop. He pulled into a climb, rolled, and dove again, his guns hammering like thunder. By the end of the day, he had 3 confirmed kills, and his unit had protected dozens of bombers that made it home alive. For his actions, Mahurin became one of the first P-47 aces of the war. But the price was steep. Every week, pilots were lost, shot down, captured, or missing in action. The Thunderbolt could take enormous punishment, but even steel had its limits. Over the fields of Normandy, France, and Belgium, wrecked P-47s smoldered among the hedgerows. German villagers would later recall finding these massive machines torn open, their pilots still inside. Young men from Kansas, Texas, or New York who had crossed an ocean to fight. And yet, the flow of replacements never stopped. America's industrial power ensured that for every Thunderbolt lost, another took its place. Faster, tougher, better armed. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe began to feel the pressure. Fuel shortages, pilot fatigue, and relentless Allied bombing were eroding their strength. The once invincible German aces were now outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. Zemke's Wolfpack had become a legend. Their tactics, discipline, altitude, teamwork turned the Thunderbolt from an underdog into a killer. The group's motto said it all: find the enemy, destroy him, and come home. And they did. By December 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had destroyed more than 200 German aircraft and suffered fewer losses than any other American fighter unit in the theater. The Flying Milk Bottle had become a name whispered with both fear and respect. Behind every mission, though, were men, not machines. Pilots sat in freezing cockpits, oxygen masks frosting over, hearts pounding. They watched friends explode in the air, helpless to intervene. They returned to base, silent, the smell of gunpowder still on their gloves. Each sortie took a piece of them. In the officers' clubs at night, laughter mixed with grief. A glass raised for those who didn't return. Another mission awaited at dawn. The Thunderbolt was strong, but its pilots were stronger. By the end of 1943, the skies over Europe were changing. The Luftwaffe's dominance was fading. The arrival of the P-47 and soon, the long-range P-51 Mustang turned the tide. The bombers that once flew to their deaths were now guarded by steel angels. And at the forefront of that transformation stood the Thunderbolt. Once ridiculed as a milk bottle, now feared as the hammer of the heavens. The German pilots no longer mocked its shape. They recognized it instantly: a silver flash, a roar of engines, and the blinding storm of 8.50 caliber guns. In the cold skies above Europe, 1943 was the year the Thunderbolt proved its name. It didn't just fly into combat. It brought the sound of thunder, and it never stopped rolling. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had become a brutal, daily struggle for control of the skies. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once doubted and mocked, was now the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Forces Fighter Command. But victory was still far away. Germany's Luftwaffe remained deadly, experienced, and desperate. Every mission over France was a gamble against time, weather, and a relentless enemy. This was the Thunderbolt's trial by fire. In January, the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, moved into new forward bases in England. The weather was miserable. Rain turned the runways into rivers of mud. Freezing fog grounded aircraft for days at a time, and the cold pierced through flight suits. Yet when the clouds broke, the call always came, "Scramble!" Engines roared to life, the deep growl of the Pratt and Whitney R2800 shaking the ground. Mechanics leaped back as the jugs rolled toward takeoff. The pilots knew what awaited them beyond the channel: flak, fighters, and death. But they went anyway. The missions were brutal. Their orders were clear: protect the bombers and, when possible, hunt the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. The German response was fierce. Squadrons of Bf-109GS and Fw-190s rose from airfields hidden among the French countryside. They were fast, agile, and flown by aces hardened by years of combat. One of them was Oberleutnant Heinrich Bahr, already a veteran with more than 150 kills. He and his men knew every trick in the book: feint attacks, head-ons, surprise dives out of the sun. They had seen everything except the kind of punishment the Thunderbolt could take. On February 20th, 1944, Operation Argument, known later as Big Week, began. The Allies launched an all-out air assault on Germany's aircraft factories. The skies over northern France turned into a swirling chaos of contrails and fire. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s thundered eastward, escorted by squadrons of P-47s. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had into the fight. That day, Captain Francis "Gabby" Gabreski led his flight of Thunderbolts through heavy cloud cover near Amiens. Suddenly, the radio erupted, "Bandits! 3 o'clock low." A swarm of Fw-190s sliced through the formation, cannon shells tearing into a B-17's wing. The bomber burst into flames, spinning toward the ground. "Gabreski dove?" The P-47 screamed as it broke through the cloud deck. He lined up behind a German fighter and squeezed the trigger. 8.50 caliber guns roared in unison. The Focke-Wulf disintegrated in midair. Gabreski pulled hard into a climb, tracers flashing past his canopy. 2 more Germans were on his tail. He rolled inverted, dove vertically, and leveled out just above the treetops, the kind of maneuver only a Thunderbolt could survive. The pursuing Fw-190s tried to follow, but their engines couldn't handle the dive. Both smashed into the ground seconds later. When Gabreski landed, his ground crew counted over 200 bullet holes in his plane and 1 missing aileron. The jug had saved him again. As winter turned to spring, the Allies intensified their campaign. The Normandy invasion was coming, and air superiority was essential. P-47 units began shifting from pure escort duty to fighter-bomber operations, striking railways, bridges, convoys, and communication lines. The pilots called it Jabo's work. They flew low, sometimes just 100 feet above the ground, to strafe German transport and troop movements. It was dangerous, dirty work. Flak gunners hid in barns and church towers. One burst could tear a Thunderbolt apart. Yet the jug's rugged frame often brought its pilots home with half a wing missing, the engine leaking oil, and smoke trailing for miles. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, one of the war's most famous aces, survived 21 missions despite being shot to pieces multiple times. On one occasion, after a dogfight over northern France, his P-47 was riddled with more than 200 hits. Oil covered his windshield, his canopy jammed, and control cables were nearly severed. Yet the Thunderbolt refused to die. Johnson barely made it back to England, crash landing in a farmer's field. When mechanics examined the wreck, they shook their heads in disbelief. Another pilot might have been lost, but the jug lived up to its legend. By May 1944, the Thunderbolts ruled the skies over France. The Luftwaffe, battered and outnumbered, began avoiding direct confrontations. Still, there were moments of savage intensity. One such day came on May 12, 1944, when hundreds of American bombers struck railway yards in France. The German response was immediate. Dozens of Bf-109s and Fw-190s rose from bases near Reims and Beauvais. At 25,000 feet, the contrails of both sides intertwined in deadly spirals. Major David Schilling, another of Zemke's best, led his squadron into the fight. "Stay fast. Hit once. Get out," he barked over the radio. He spotted a 109 attacking a straggling B-24. Schilling Dove closed in and opened fire. The German fighter burst into flames, but before Schilling could climb away, another 190 appeared out of nowhere, firing from below. Cannon shells ripped through his right wing. Smoke filled the cockpit. Schilling yanked the stick, the P-47 groaning under the stress. He managed to roll, dive, and escape into the clouds. Minutes later, he emerged over the English Channel, engine sputtering, fuel nearly gone. He landed safely at Manston, shaken but alive. That night, he wrote in his journal, "The Jug saved me again. I owe my life to this brute of a plane." As D-Day approached, the tempo increased to a fever pitch. Thunderbolts flew hundreds of sorties daily, striking radar stations, fuel depots, and troop convoys. For many young pilots, this was baptism by fire. They were barely 20 years old, thrown into a war that gave no second chances. The veterans taught them: never dogfight a 190 in a turn, never climb with a 109, and never linger over the target. They learned fast or they didn't come back. By June 1944, the stage was set. The Thunderbolt had proven itself beyond all doubt. Could escort, it could fight, it could dive, and it could destroy. The Luftwaffe was crumbling under the relentless pressure. Fuel shortages crippled training, and their best aces were gone. Over France, the once fearsome Black-Crossed fighters now appeared in smaller and smaller numbers. When the invasion of Normandy began on June 6th, the P-47s struck from dawn until dusk, blasting German armor, trains, and reinforcements trying to reach the beaches. For the men who flew it, the Jug was no longer just a machine. It was a companion, a protector, a symbol of survival. By the end of the summer, the P-47 had become one of the most feared sights in the European sky. German soldiers called it Der Donnerbalken, the thunder beam, because of the sound it made before unleashing destruction. From the early struggles of 1943 to the fiery skies of France in 1944, the Thunderbolt had been tested again and again. Each time it came back stronger. It was no longer the flying milk bottle. It was the hammer that broke the Luftwaffe's back. And for the young men who flew it, every mission over France was a reminder of one simple truth. They weren't just fighting for victory. They were fighting to live long enough to see home again. By mid-1944, the world had changed. The Allies stood at the edge of a massive turning point. The beaches of Normandy had been stormed, the foothold in France secured, and the long road to Berlin had begun. Above it all, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug, thundered across the sky like a symbol of unstoppable power. Once mocked as bulky and awkward, the Jug had become the most feared and respected fighter bomber in Europe. And in the months following D-Day, it truly earned its name. June 6, 1944, D-Day. At dawn, the first light revealed a sight no one in history had ever seen before. Thousands of ships stretching from horizon to horizon, tens of thousands of men storming the beaches, and above them, an almost unbroken wall of Allied aircraft. The Thunderbolts were there, flying low through the salty air. Their job was to keep the skies clear and the German defenses shattered. From 5 a.m. onward, P-47s of the 9th Air Force struck everything that moved, bunkers, bridges, gun emplacements, and convoys trying to reach the beaches. Each jug carried bombs, rockets, and thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. They dove through curtains of flak and smoke, engines howling, wings trembling as they released their payloads. When the bombs hit, the ground erupted in fire and steel. For the soldiers fighting below, that deep, roaring sound in the sky, the sound of the thunderbolt, became a promise of survival. As the invasion force pushed inland, the jug became the soldier's best friend. Every road, every bridge, every hedgerow in Normandy could hide a German ambush. Whenever ground troops radioed for help, the thunderbolts answered. The 404th, 362nd, and 365th Fighter Groups became legends overnight. They flew multiple missions a day, landing only long enough to refuel and reload before roaring back into battle. Pilots learned to fly by instinct, following roads, smoke trails, and the faint glimmer of enemy armor below. They strafed tanks, supply trucks, trains, and even troop columns retreating through narrow country roads. The Germans called it Jabberskreck, terror of the fighter bombers. And for good reason. A single P-47 could tear through a column of vehicles in seconds, its 8 machine guns chewing through metal like paper. When they carried rockets, even Tiger tanks were not safe. One German survivor later recalled, "When we heard the sound of the thunderbolt, we knew it was over. You couldn't hide. You could only pray." What made the jug so successful was not only its firepower but its durability. The Thunderbolt was practically indestructible. Its air-cooled radial engine could take incredible damage and still run. Its thick armor and sturdy wings allowed it to absorb punishment that would destroy any other fighter. Captain Robert S. Johnson, who had already survived being shot to pieces months earlier, once said, "The P-47 could bring you home on one cylinder and a prayer." And it did again and again. In one mission over northern France, Lieutenant Jack O'Brien took a direct flak hit to his right wing. The blast blew away a section of metal the size of a door. His gauges failed, his plane shook violently, and oil poured into the cockpit. But somehow the jug kept flying. O'Brien limped back across the channel, landed on a shredded runway, and climbed out, trembling but alive. His crew chief just stared and said, "Sir, that thing shouldn't be in one piece." The jug had earned its name once more. The nickname jug itself had an uncertain origin. Some say it came from its round, milk bottle shape, a nod to the flying milk bottle insult from the Luftwaffe. Others claim it was short for juggernaut. Unstoppable, unbreakable, and brutally powerful. Both were true. By the summer of 1944, the P-47 was no longer a joke. It was a juggernaut of war. In July, as the Allies broke out from Normandy and swept across France, the Thunderbolt squadrons followed closely behind. They moved to hastily built airstrips, sometimes just dirt runways carved out of wheat fields. From there, they struck deeper into enemy territory, hitting German convoys retreating toward Paris and the Rhine. Pilots often flew 5 or 6 missions a day. They returned covered in sweat and oil, faces blackened from smoke and gunpowder. Their voices were hoarse from shouting over the engine noise. But they knew what they were accomplishing: total air dominance. The Luftwaffe tried to resist, but it was already broken. Fuel was scarce, and replacements were poorly trained. German aces who once mocked the jug now dreaded the sight of its silhouette in the sun. One captured German pilot told his interrogators, "We used to think the Thunderbolt was too slow. Now we think it's too many." As summer turned to autumn, the P-47's mission changed again. The Thunderbolts became the flying artillery of the advancing Allied armies. Wherever Patton's tanks rolled, the jug was never far behind. They blasted bridges to trap retreating German divisions, strafed rail lines to cut off supplies, and hammered enemy positions with bombs and rockets. In August, during the Battle of Falaise, P-47s played a decisive role. Thousands of German troops and vehicles were trapped in a pocket, desperately trying to escape east. Thunderbolts descended in waves, unleashing destruction so intense that soldiers on the ground described it as a storm of fire. By the end of the day, the valley was littered with the wrecks of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, the Luftwaffe powerless to intervene. The road to Paris lay open. By September 1944, the Thunderbolt was everywhere: France, Belgium, Holland, and soon the skies over Germany itself. It had earned a reputation not just as a fighter, but as a weapon of total dominance. Its pilots had become living legends. Men like Gabreski, Zemke, Johnson, and Schilling, all of whom owed their lives to the aircraft they once doubted. The Jug had proven that brute strength and raw power could win not only dogfights but entire battles. In the hangars, ground crews painted new nose art: fierce tigers, sharks, and eagles, each representing a pilot's victories. The engines were patched and repatched, wings replaced, bullet holes filled with metal plates. Every scar told a story of survival. When the mechanics revved the engines and the deep thunder rolled across the field, even the men on the ground felt it in their chests. It was the heartbeat of the Allied air war, heavy, powerful, and relentless. By the time 1944 drew to a close, the Jug had completely transformed the air war in Western Europe. It had destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands of vehicles on the ground. It was feared, respected, and, by those who flew it, loved. The P-47 was not graceful. It was not pretty, but it was indestructible. And in war, that mattered more than anything. The Jug had earned its name not from how it looked, but from what it could do. It was the hammer of the skies, the thunder that never stopped rolling. And for every pilot who strapped into its cockpit, there was comfort in knowing that no matter how fierce the fight, the Jug would do everything it could to bring them home. Because thunder never asks for permission, it simply strikes. By late 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had already proven itself in the air: a brutal duelist, a protector of bombers, and the heavyweight champion of the European skies. But the war was changing. The Luftwaffe was crumbling, and the need for air superiority was slowly being replaced by a new demand: direct, relentless support for the armies fighting on the ground. And in this new chapter of warfare, the Jug evolved again. It became the most feared ground attack aircraft in Europe, the flying hammer of the Allied advance. When the Allies broke out of Normandy in August 1944, their armored divisions began to surge across France. The enemy wasn't defeated yet. The German army was retreating in order, leaving behind ambushes, minefields, and rearguard actions that slowed every mile of progress. The call went out to the air forces: keep them moving, don't let them regroup. That order transformed the Thunderbolt's role. It was no longer just a fighter. It became a fighter-bomber, a close air support machine unlike anything that had flown before. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It came from experience, from the hard lessons learned in hundreds of missions. At first, Thunderbolt pilots relied mostly on strafing runs, diving low and firing their 8.50 caliber guns at enemy convoys. Each burst lasted only a few seconds, but the results were devastating. Trucks exploded, locomotives tore apart, and troops scattered in panic. But as the war moved deeper into France and Belgium, the Germans began to adapt. They hid tanks under trees, camouflaged vehicles with branches, and moved only at night. The Thunderbolt pilots needed more than bullets; they needed bombs and rockets. In September 1944, new versions of the P-47D began rolling off the production line with reinforced wings and stronger pylons. Now, each aircraft could carry up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance, two 1,000-pound bombs, and 10 5-inch rockets. The Jug had become a flying artillery piece. The tactics evolved just as fast. Pilots began training in precision dive attacks, approaching targets at steep angles, sometimes as much as 60 degrees, and releasing their bombs at just 2,000 feet. Took nerves of steel. A single mistake meant pulling out too late and slamming into the ground. To help with accuracy, ground forces began using smoke markers and radio signals to call in strikes. For the first time, air and ground worked as one, a coordinated war machine powered by speed and precision. One of the first groups to master the new tactics was the 362nd Fighter Group, nicknamed the Magens Maulers. Flying from forward bases in France, they specialized in low-altitude attacks on enemy supply lines. On September 20th, they intercepted a German armored column near Nancy. Within minutes, dozens of Thunderbolts were swooping in, releasing bombs and firing rockets. Tanks exploded one after another, ammunition trucks went up in flames, and the narrow country road turned into a river of black smoke. A French civilian who witnessed the attack later said, "The sky was full of thunder, and the earth shook. The Germans had no chance." The Thunderbolt's durability made it perfect for this dangerous work. Unlike the slender P-51 Mustang or the twin-engined P-38 Lightning, the P-47 could absorb incredible punishment. Its big radial engine had no coolant system to leak, and its armored cockpit gave the pilot a fighting chance even when hit by anti-aircraft fire. One pilot, Lieutenant William Dunham, returned from a mission with his wing shredded by flak and one rocket still attached. The fuse had jammed. He landed, sweating and pale, and told his crew chief, "Next time, I'll try not to bring the fireworks home." The mechanics counted 183 holes in his fuselage. The Jug had brought him back again. By autumn, the Thunderbolt had become the primary close support aircraft for Allied ground forces. Its missions ranged from destroying tanks and artillery to attacking bridges, trains, and even river barges carrying fuel and supplies. The new 5-inch high-velocity rockets gave it power once reserved for bombers. Pilots described firing them as launching spears of fire. When they hit, even the mighty Tiger and Panther tanks were vulnerable. Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the famed 56th Fighter Group, called the rocket-equipped Jug the best tank killer in the sky. As the Allied armies advanced toward the German border, the airfields moved with them. Makeshift runways appeared in every liberated region. Stretches of dirt and pierced steel planking built by engineers who could lay a new base in just 2 days. The pilots slept in tents beside their planes, ate rations out of tins, and flew 5 or 6 sorties a day. The work was exhausting, but the results were undeniable. General Patton's Third Army often advanced faster than its supply lines could follow. He later wrote, "Without the Thunderbolts, my tanks could not have moved. The Jug is my best artillery." By late 1944, the P-47's reputation as a ground attacker was unmatched. German troops nicknamed it Der Bulldozer der Luft, the bulldozer of the sky. They feared its whistle long before they saw it. Stories spread through the German ranks of entire battalions wiped out by a single squadron of Thunderbolts. And in truth, those stories were often real. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the Jug faced its greatest test yet. The weather was freezing, the skies were foggy, and visibility was almost zero. For days, the Allied air forces were grounded while German panzers pushed deep into Belgium. Then, on December 23rd, the clouds broke. Hundreds of Thunderbolts roared into the air. They attacked columns of tanks and trucks crammed along narrow forest roads. Rockets streaked through the sky like lightning, bombs sent shockwaves through the valleys, and the once invincible panzer divisions were torn apart. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but their numbers were too few and their fuel too scarce. Within 48 hours, the German advance had been crippled. not by artillery or armor, but by the thunder from above. The ground attack evolution of the P-47 changed not only the war, but military thinking forever. The idea that a single-engine fighter could replace heavy bombers in tactical warfare was revolutionary. After the war, this concept would shape every future Air Force, from the American A-10 Warthog to modern multi-role jets. The Thunderbolt had shown that the key to victory wasn't just who ruled the skies, but who could shape the battle on the ground. By early 1945, the P-47 had destroyed more than 86,000 enemy vehicles, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 armored units in Europe alone. It was the ultimate proof that a plane once ridiculed for its size had become the most effective weapon in the Allied arsenal. The Jug had evolved from a fighter into a war machine, a fusion of steel, thunder, and determination. And when the pilots climbed down after each mission, faces black with soot, hands shaking from adrenaline, they would look back at their battered aircraft and pat its nose. Every dent, every scar, every patch of burned paint told the story of survival. The Jug had not only earned its name, it had redefined what air power could mean. From the skies above Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the thunder rolled on, unstoppable, unyielding, and unforgettable. By early 1944, the skies over Europe had become a deadly chessboard of strategy, courage, and steel. The German Luftwaffe still held formidable power, but the balance was shifting. American bombers, flying deep into occupied Europe, needed constant protection, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was about to prove itself not just as a guardian, but as a predator. At dawn, rows of Thunderbolts lined up on muddy English airfields, engines rumbling like a storm waiting to break. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, their leather jackets heavy with cold and adrenaline. They knew that once they crossed the English Channel, there was no turning back. Over France and Germany, waiting for them in the icy clouds, were the Luftwaffe's best Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. The German pilots were veterans of years of combat, trained to fight and survive. They'd faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Mustangs. But the P-47 was different. It was massive, fast, and terrifyingly durable. When the Luftwaffe first encountered the Thunderbolt in large numbers, they underestimated it again. Too heavy, some said, too slow in a climb. But the Americans knew its secret weapon, the dive. At 30,000 feet, Thunderbolt pilots often lured German fighters into pursuing them. Then, with engines screaming, they nosed down into a terrifying dive. Thanks to its robust frame and turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the Jug could dive faster than any German aircraft in the sky. While the Focke-Wulf strained and shuddered at 480 miles per hour, the P-47 thundered past 500 without breaking apart. Captain Robert S. Johnson of the 56 Fighter Group was one of the first to demonstrate just how indestructible the Thunderbolt could be. In June 1943, while escorting bombers over France, Johnson's plane was hit again and again. Cannon shells tore through his fuselage, oil splattered across his windshield, and smoke filled the cockpit. He was trapped. The canopy was jammed. Then a German FW-190 appeared beside him. Its pilot, Lieutenant Egon Mayer, the commander of Jägerschwader II, circled Johnson's crippled P-47, then lined up behind him to finish the kill. Mayer fired burst after burst from his 20mm cannons, shredding the tail, tearing holes through the wings, but Johnson's Thunderbolt refused to die. When Mayer finally ran out of ammunition, he dipped his wing in salute and flew away. Johnson managed to limp back across the channel, landing with 21 cannon holes and hundreds of bullet impacts. His aircraft was practically destroyed, but it had brought him home alive. The legend of the Jug's invincibility spread like wildfire. By 1944, the Thunderbolt had earned a reputation for domination. American pilots began to hunt the Luftwaffe aggressively. Major Gaby Gabreski, the top American ace in the European theater, scored most of his 28 kills in AP-47. He called it the perfect balance of power and punishment. Gabreski and his squadron would attack from altitude, dive through German formations, fire their 8.50 caliber guns, and then climb away in a thunderous roar before the enemy could react. German intelligence reports began to reflect growing concern. Pilots described the P-47 as a monster, one that could take incredible damage, strike hard, and escape at will. The Luftwaffe's command issued new tactics to avoid head-on or turning fights with Thunderbolts. Instead, they were instructed to strike from above and disengage quickly. But even those tactics began to fail as the Thunderbolts' range increased with drop tanks, allowing them to escort bombers deeper into Germany. One of the most decisive engagements came during the spring of 1944, over Germany's industrial heartland. A formation of B-17s heading toward Schweinfurt was ambushed by over 60 German fighters. As the bombers' tight formations broke apart under the assault, 12 Thunderbolts from the 78th Fighter Group dove into the chaos. The sky erupted with tracer fire. FW-190 scattered as the .50 caliber guns of the Jugs lit up the horizon. Within minutes, 6 German fighters were burning or falling in pieces. Pilots reported that the .50 caliber slugs tore through cockpits and fuel tanks with merciless precision. One Luftwaffe ace described seeing a comrade's plane disintegrate as if torn apart by invisible claws. For the Germans, every encounter with a Thunderbolt was a gamble, one that was increasingly impossible to win. As the war progressed, the Luftwaffe faced another problem: exhaustion. Experienced German aces were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Meanwhile, American factories were producing Thunderbolts by the thousands, and new pilots were being trained at a relentless pace. The air superiority that had once belonged to Germany was slipping away with every mission. In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces advanced through Normandy, the P-47 continued to hammer both the air and the ground. Luftwaffe units trying to resist were often caught on takeoff or landing, their airfields strafed and bombed into ruin. German pilots began calling the Thunderbolt der Fleischwolf, the meat grinder. It was brutal, relentless, and everywhere. The psychological impact was immense. Luftwaffe briefings warned pilots not to engage Thunderbolts below 15,000 feet unless they had overwhelming advantage. But few heeded the warning. Many never made it home. By late 1944, the tide was irreversible. The once proud Luftwaffe, battered and depleted, could no longer match the swarm of Allied fighters dominating the skies. The P-47 had transformed from a ridiculed, flying milk bottle into a nightmare of thunder and flame. In the final months of the war, Thunderbolt squadrons flew deep into Germany, escorting bombers and striking any target that moved. Locomotives, convoys, tanks, and even airfields. When the war finally ended, the numbers spoke for themselves. The P-47 had destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. The Luftwaffe pilots who once mocked its shape now spoke of it with respect and fear. Many admitted that the Thunderbolt was the last plane they wanted to see in their gun sight. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't graceful, but it was unstoppable. And so, the P-47 earned its reputation not through elegance, but through endurance, power, and sheer defiance. Against the best Germany could offer, the Thunderbolt had thundered through the storm and emerged victorious. By 1944, the skies over Europe had become a vast, deadly arena filled with smoke, fire, and courage. Thousands of pilots fought, lived, and died in the clouds. But behind the roar of engines and gunfire were the voices of men who saw it all. This chapter reveals their stories, from both sides of the war, American and German, enemies in the air yet bound by the same fear, respect, and humanity. Captain Robert S. Johnson of the 56 Fighter Group once said, "When you face another man in the air, it's not about nations or politics. It's survival. You see his face for only a second, but you never forget it." Johnson's words echoed the experiences of hundreds of American pilots who had come to respect their opponents, men who fought with equal skill and desperation for their own country's sky. One cold morning in early 1944, over the skies of northern France, Lieutenant James "Hotshot" Goodson was escorting a formation of B-17 bombers when his flight was ambushed by a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s. Goodson dove straight into the fight, his 8.50 caliber guns blazing. Within seconds, a German fighter exploded in a flash of flame. But as he circled, he caught sight of the pilot bailing out, his parachute blossoming like a white flower amid the smoke. "He wasn't a monster," Goodson later wrote. "He was just another pilot trying to get home alive." Across the front lines, German ace Oberleutnant Heinz Bahr shared a similar thought. Bahr, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, had more than 200 kills to his name. But he admitted that the Thunderbolt changed how the Luftwaffe viewed the Americans. "We called it the flying tank," he said in an interview after the war. "At first we laughed at its shape, but then we learned to respect it. You could shoot it, and it would still come after you." Bahr described one encounter in vivid detail. His squadron had intercepted a formation of Thunderbolts escorting bombers over Germany. They were climbing fast, protecting their bombers like a wall of steel, he recalled. "I picked one and fired. I saw pieces fly off, but it did not fall. Turned and came straight at me. I dove to escape, and it chased me all the way down to 5,000 feet. That day I realized the Americans were not amateurs anymore." On the American side, Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, the top U.S. ace in the European theater, often spoke with deep respect for his Luftwaffe counterparts. "They were damn good pilots," he said. "They fought hard and they fought smart. But by 1944 they were running out of fuel, out of planes, and out of time. We had numbers and replacements, they didn't." Gabreski recalled that even in victory, there was little joy. Every time you saw a parachute open below you, you thought, "That could be me tomorrow." In one recorded debriefing after a dogfight, Thunderbolt pilot William Dunham described how he downed a German Bf-109 near Aachen. After landing, he learned the German pilot had survived and been captured. Dunham visited the airfield where the prisoner was held. The two men spoke through a translator, trading stories of the battle. The German pilot smiled and said, "I thought I had you. Then I saw the size of your plane and realized I was in trouble." Dunham laughed and handed him a cigarette. Years later, they would meet again, this time as friends at a reunion in Germany. As the war dragged on, both sides began to see the toll it took on human lives. Luftwaffe pilot Karl-Heinz Ossenkopf wrote in his diary in late 1944, "There are too many Thunderbolts now. We are few, always fewer. When I look up and see them, I no longer feel anger, only exhaustion. The Americans are brave. We are brave. But courage is no longer enough." American pilots shared similar fatigue. Many had flown over 100 missions, watching friends vanish in fireballs or disappear into the clouds. Some returned to base with bullet holes in their wings and tears in their eyes. "You never celebrate a kill," one pilot wrote. "You just thank God it wasn't you." Despite the brutality, a curious sense of mutual respect began to form. When the war ended and former enemies finally met face to face, many realized how alike they were. They had all been young, fearless, and scared men who had spent their best years in the thin, cold air of Europe's battlefields. In 1946, during an air show in Germany, former Luftwaffe and U.S. Army Air Forces pilots met for the first time in peace. A German veteran approached an American in a leather jacket bearing the 56th Fighter Group insignia. "Were you flying Thunderbolts?" he asked. The American nodded. The German smiled faintly. "Then I have met your kind before in the clouds over the Ruhr. You fought well." The American replied quietly, "So did you." Interviews from both sides in the years that followed revealed a common truth. The war in the air had not been about hatred, but about survival. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked as a flying milk bottle, had become a symbol of resilience, not just of American engineering, but of the spirit of the men who flew it. German pilot Hans Eckhard Bob summarized it best when he said, "In those days we fought for our country, for our comrades, and for the man beside us. The P-47 was a fine aircraft, killed many of us, but I can only admire it. It was strong, like the men who flew it." And from the American side, Captain Johnson's final wartime reflection stands as a bridge between former foes. "The men we fought weren't villains. They were pilots, same as us. When I think back on the Thunderbolt, I don't think of victory. I think of survival and of respect." By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the skies of Europe were quiet again. The Thunderbolt and the Luftwaffe had clashed for years, titans of metal and courage. But in the end, it was not hatred that remained. It was the shared memory of those who dared to rise above the clouds and meet each other in the thin air between life and death. The voices from both sides, brave, weary, and honest, remind us that even in war, there can be understanding. And in that understanding, perhaps, lies peace. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not emerge fully formed from a blueprint. It was the product of ingenuity, ambition, and relentless problem-solving. A beast born from the minds of engineers who refused to accept limitations. At a time when air warfare demanded speed, firepower, and resilience, the Thunderbolt's designers at Republic Aviation were tasked with something unprecedented. Create a fighter capable of surviving in the harshest skies, delivering destructive power, and returning pilots home alive. It all began with Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born engineer who would become the Thunderbolt's father. Kartveli had already designed fighters for Seversky Aviation, but the U.S. Army Air Corps wanted something larger, faster, and more heavily armed than anything that had come before. Kartveli envisioned a plane that could absorb punishment, carry massive armament, and climb higher and faster than its contemporaries. To many, it seemed impossible. The first challenge was size. Most fighters at the time were small and nimble, optimized for dogfighting but fragile. Kartveli, however, insisted on a plane with a massive radial engine, robust fuselage, and thick armor plating. The result was the R-2800 double Wasp engine, a two-row, 18-cylinder radial powerhouse producing nearly 2,000 horsepower. It could sustain hits from both cannon and machine gun fire and still roar across the sky, a living testament to mechanical endurance. The next innovation was turbosupercharging. Unlike European fighters, which lost power at high altitude, the P-47 could climb and fight in the thin upper atmosphere. Engineers developed a complex system of ducts and compressors to feed the engine, allowing pilots to escort bombers deep into Germany, something no other Allied fighter could achieve consistently in the early years of the war. But power alone was not enough. The Thunderbolt had to survive. Its fuselage was reinforced with armor plating around the cockpit and vital systems, giving pilots a chance to return even after sustaining multiple hits. Fuel tanks were encased in self-sealing bladders, an innovation that drastically reduced the risk of catastrophic fire. Test pilots regularly returned with holes large enough to see the sky through, yet the plane continued to fly. These combat tests, cemented the Jug's reputation for indestructibility long before it faced its first Luftwaffe ace. The armament was another engineering triumph. 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns were mounted in the wings, giving the Thunderbolt unmatched firepower. Engineers had to carefully balance the weight and recoil so that pilots could maintain control while unleashing torrents of bullets. Later, underwing racks allowed P-47s to carry bombs and rockets, transforming the plane from a pure escort fighter into a versatile ground attack platform. This duality, air superiority and tactical bombardment, was unprecedented. Flight control presented its own hurdles. With such a large fuselage and heavy engine, early prototypes struggled with maneuverability. Kartveli and his team spent months refining the ailerons, elevators, and rudder. Test pilots described the first flights as terrifying. The plane was massive, sluggish in turns, and required strength and precision to control. But once the final adjustments were made, the Thunderbolt surprised everyone. It could dive faster than any German fighter, withstand punishment, and climb aggressively when needed. One of the lesser-known but crucial innovations was the landing gear. Engineers designed a robust, wide-track gear system to handle rough airstrips in forward areas. This allowed pilots to land in fields and temporary bases in France, Belgium, and later Germany. Many planes returned from missions battered and bullet-ridden, landing on airstrips that would have destroyed any other aircraft. The design choices made on the drawing board became literal lifesavers for pilots across Europe. The P-47's engineering was not just mechanical but logistical. Republic Aviation and the U.S. Army Air Corps coordinated with supply chains to ensure that thousands of parts could be produced, shipped, and assembled rapidly. Entire factories operated around the clock, producing a plane that combined speed, power, durability, and lethality, at a scale that Germany could not match late in the war. It was this combination that earned the Thunderbolt its legendary reputation. Pilots like Gabby Gabreski and Robert Johnson often returned with planes riddled with bullet holes, yet the engine still roared, the controls responded, and the guns remained functional. In one notable instance, a Jug returned from a mission with more than 500 hits in its fuselage, including damage to the wings and rudder. Engineers marveled at the resilience. Mechanics joked that the plane was held together with courage and duct tape. Kartveli's vision extended beyond raw power. He understood that the pilot's experience mattered. The cockpit was designed with visibility in mind, giving pilots a wide field of view for spotting enemies or ground targets. Instruments were arranged logically, allowing rapid decision-making under extreme stress. Even the placement of switches and levers considered the pilot's ergonomics, an engineering detail that saved lives when seconds counted. The engineering of the Thunderbolt culminated in a machine that was more than metal and rivets. It was a combination of innovation, daring, and relentless testing. By 1944, it was the largest single-engine fighter to see service, yet it could outclimb, outdive, and outgun nearly every opponent it faced. The plane's impact was immediate and decisive. Historians later credited the Thunderbolt's design as a turning point in air warfare. Its durability allowed the U.S. to sustain long-range bombing campaigns, protect bomber formations, and devastate enemy supply lines. Pilots survived missions that would have been fatal in lighter fighters. Its design philosophies, turbo-supercharged engines, heavy armament, armored cockpits, influenced aircraft development for decades. In short, the P-47 was a beast engineered for the extremes of war. Every rivet, every calculation, and every test flight reflected a philosophy of resilience and lethality. Kartveli and his team did not just build a plane. They built a lifeline for thousands of pilots who would risk everything over Europe. By the time Allied forces pushed into Germany in 1945, the Thunderbolt had become a symbol, the embodiment of American industrial might, ingenuity, and determination. It was feared by enemies, respected by allies, and loved by the men who flew it. The flying milk bottle had evolved into a juggernaut, a flying testament to what careful engineering, daring design, and relentless testing could achieve. And for every pilot who climbed into the cockpit, the lesson was clear. This beast was built to survive, built to fight, and built to win. June 6, 1944, D-Day. A day etched in history. A day when the skies above Normandy would thunder with the roar of engines, the crackle of guns, and the resolve of thousands of men fighting for freedom. For the P-47 Thunderbolt, this was the moment it would cement its reputation as both a guardian and a weapon of devastation. The early hours were tense and chaotic. Allied forces had amassed an unprecedented armada, thousands of ships, planes, and men converging on the beaches of northern France. Above the English Channel, squadrons of Thunderbolts waited, engines humming like distant thunder, wings gleaming in the first light of dawn. Each pilot understood the stakes. The success of the invasion and the lives of soldiers on the ground depended on their performance. The mission was twofold: escort the bombers that would strike German fortifications along the coast, and provide close air support for troops landing under relentless enemy fire. The Thunderbolts were armed to perfection. 8.50 caliber machine guns, bombs, and rockets, each plane a flying arsenal capable of turning the tide in seconds. As the first waves of bombers approached the beaches, German flak erupted from bunkers and pillboxes. Anti-aircraft fire shredded the sky in trails of smoke and sparks. For the pilots, it was a deadly ballet, weaving through explosions, dodging bullets, and maintaining formation while the sound of thunderous engines filled every inch of the cockpit. Captain Robert S. Johnson recalled the moment vividly. The sky was chaos, yet everything was precise. You had to fly fast, fly low, and never hesitate. Every second counted. Lives depended on it. The Thunderbolts descended upon their targets like a hammer striking steel. Coastal batteries, machine gun nests, and armored bunkers were strafed and bombed in rapid succession. The Jugs .50 caliber bullets tore through reinforced walls, while rockets and bombs disintegrated gun emplacements in fireballs of debris. Ground troops watched in awe and relief as these massive planes unleashed destruction with surgical precision. It wasn't just brute force that made the P-47 indispensable. Its durability allowed pilots to survive missions that would have destroyed other aircraft. Pilots returned with wings perforated by flak, cockpits scorched, and engines smoking, yet the plane remained airworthy. Lieutenant Jack O'Brien, after a particularly harrowing run over Omaha Beach, described his landing, "I expected to crash. Instead, I rolled onto the airstrip like nothing had happened. That plane saved my life, more than once." The coordination between air and ground forces was unprecedented. Forward observers and radio operators guided Thunderbolts toward enemy strongpoints, marking positions with smoke and flares. Pilots adapted rapidly, diving through low-hanging clouds, avoiding artillery fire, and striking with deadly accuracy. Each sortie contributed to the overall push of the Allied armies, softening defenses before troops even set foot on the sand. The psychological effect on German defenders was profound. Veterans of the Atlantic Wall reported that the roar of the Thunderbolt was as terrifying as the bullets themselves. Soldiers knew that once the flying milk bottles appeared, retreat was nearly impossible, and survival depended on immediate cover. As historian Eric Berger notes, the Thunderbolt did not just attack, it dominated the battlefield. Thunderbolts also provided critical protection for bombers. Luftwaffe fighters attempted to intercept the formation, but the P-47s were relentless. They dove from above, engaged enemy aircraft, and cleared the skies, ensuring the bombers reached their targets with fewer losses. It was this dual-role fighter and fighter-bomber that distinguished the Jug from every other aircraft in the Allied arsenal. By noon, the beaches were littered with destroyed German positions, smoke rising in towering columns. Thunderbolts returned for multiple sorties, refueling and rearming on hastily constructed airstrips carved from French fields. The tempo was exhausting but necessary. Every mission, every strafing run, contributed to the momentum of the invasion. One notable account came from Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, who flew multiple missions over Utah Beach. The combination of speed, firepower, and toughness made the Thunderbolt perfect for Normandy. It could hit anything, survive anything, and bring you home alive. He recalled strafing armored columns, bombing bunkers, and protecting troop movements all in a single morning, a feat only possible with the Jug's unmatched capabilities. By the end of D-Day, the Thunderbolts had flown hundreds of sorties. Their impact was clear. German defenses were broken, the beachhead secured, and Allied troops had the breathing room to push inland. The skies of Normandy, once filled with chaos and terror, now bore the unmistakable mark of the Jug, a flying machine that combined strength, resilience, and precision. For the men on the ground, the sound of the Thunderbolt became a symbol of hope. Soldiers wrote home describing the roar of engines as reassurance that the Allies controlled both land and sky. Meanwhile, German soldiers whispered about the flying milk bottles that had turned from a joke to a nightmare. The success of the Thunderbolt in Normandy was not only a triumph of design but of tactics, coordination, and courage. Engineers had built a plane capable of withstanding punishment. Pilots had learned to exploit its strengths, and the armies had leveraged its power to secure the greatest amphibious assault in history. In the years that followed, veterans from both sides would recall the thunder over Normandy. Pilots spoke of bravery and precision, ground troops of salvation delivered from above, and historians of a turning point where air power shaped the course of battle. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once derided for its bulk, had proven itself indispensable, a juggernaut of war that left an indelible mark on the liberation of Europe. By the close of June 6, 1944, the P-47 had earned more than respect. It had earned a place in history. Its engines, guns, and armor had written a story of courage, resilience, and overwhelming firepower. A story that would echo through every mission in Europe, every battlefield over France, and every pilot who climbed into its cockpit. The thunder over Normandy was more than noise. It was the roar of a machine engineered for war, a machine that changed the course of history, and the roar of men daring to control the skies. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had flown thousands of missions, destroyed tens of thousands of enemy vehicles, and rewritten the rules of air combat. Once mocked as a flying milk bottle for its bulky frame, the Jug had earned a reputation not only for durability and firepower, but for saving countless lives. Its legacy extended far beyond the battlefields of Europe, influencing aircraft design, pilot tactics, and the very philosophy of air warfare. During the war, the P-47 had proven its versatility. From high-altitude bomber escort missions over Germany to low-level ground attacks in the Ardennes, it had adapted to every challenge. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns had shredded enemy fighters. Its bombs and rockets had decimated tanks, trains, and supply convoys. And through it all, the aircraft had earned the trust of pilots who knew it could withstand punishment that would destroy any other plane. Veteran pilots recalled returning to base after missions with wings perforated by flak, engines smoking, and fuselages riddled with bullets. Yet the plane still held together. Captain Robert S. Johnson, one of the top American aces, famously described his Thunderbolt as more than a machine. It was a guardian. The P-47's armor and radial engine, resistant to catastrophic damage, meant that pilots had a fighting chance even when everything seemed lost. The Jug's impact was not limited to survival. It fundamentally changed air combat tactics. High-speed dives, steep attack approaches, and low-altitude strafing runs became standard, and other Allied aircraft adopted similar techniques. Its turbo-supercharged engine allowed pilots to operate at altitudes that had previously been challenging for single-engine fighters, enabling them to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. A critical advantage during the bombing campaigns of 1943 to 1945. German pilots, who had once laughed at its shape, came to fear the Thunderbolt. They gave it nicknames like Der Fleischwolf, the meat grinder, acknowledging its ability to destroy armored vehicles and withstand concentrated fire. Veterans from both sides of the war often reflected on the aircraft with a mixture of awe and respect, acknowledging that it had tipped the balance of air superiority in favor of the Allies. Beyond the battlefield, the P-47 influenced aircraft design for decades. Its combination of firepower, durability, and performance set a precedent for future multi-role fighters. Engineers learned from its turbo-supercharged radial engine, rugged airframe, and self-sealing fuel tanks, features that would appear in post-war fighters and attack aircraft around the world. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, often called the modern Warthog, owes much of its design philosophy to the P-47, emphasizing survivability, low-level attack capability, and overwhelming firepower. For the pilots, the legacy was personal as well as technological. The Thunderbolt gave them confidence in battle, a chance to complete missions, and, in many cases, a path home alive. Lieutenant Jack O'Brien, who flew dozens of sorties over Normandy, recalled landing with his fuselage riddled with holes. Every dent and scratch was a story. That plane saved me more times than I can count. I owe it my life. Across Europe, countless stories like his underscored the human impact of the aircraft. In post-war commemorations, the P-47 was celebrated not just as a tool of war, but as a symbol of industrial ingenuity and American resolve. Museums around the world display restored Thunderbolts, their polished aluminum bodies shining as reminders of a time when innovation and courage converged in the skies. Veterans tell stories of missions where the Jug carried them through impossible odds, rescuing crews, clearing paths for infantry, and shaping the course of battles. The nickname, Flying Milk Bottle, once derisive, had transformed into a badge of honor. It symbolized not weakness, but resilience, not clumsiness, but power. The plane's bulk had saved lives, its engines had roared through the fiercest skies, and its guns had struck terror into enemies. In every sense, the P-47 had earned its place in history, a flying jug of steel, thunder, and determination. Even decades after the war, pilots and historians alike returned to the Thunderbolt for lessons in engineering, tactics, and leadership. The aircraft demonstrated that raw power combined with thoughtful design could redefine warfare. Its story teaches that innovation and courage often go hand in hand, and that even the most unlikely machines, once ridiculed, can become legends. As the last remaining P-47s sit in museums, air shows, and private collections, the legacy of the Flying Milk Bottle lives on. Pilots walk along its wings, touch its engines, and remember the missions, the comrades, and the battles that defined a generation. The Thunderbolt was more than a plane. It was a lifeline, a weapon, and a testament to the human drive to survive, adapt, and triumph. The Flying Milk Bottle's journey from mockery to legend encapsulates the very essence of wartime innovation. It reminds us that resilience, determination, and ingenuity, embodied in mettle and courage, can overcome skepticism, adversity, and even the deadliest of enemies. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt remains a symbol, a machine that transformed war, a guardian of men, and an enduring legacy of a generation that dared to thunder over Europe and reshape history forever.